Welcome to Hawksong Weaving. My name is Took. I'm a disabled weaver, and today I'm breaking all the rules with my adaptive warping method to explain why I have those rules in the first place. I hope you enjoy. Life takes odd turns, but even tattered and worn yarn still has value. Tired joints and health flares don't have to stop the journey. Welcome to Hawksong Weaving, where all our paths are a little bit warped. So I'll admit that the title and the intro was a bit of clickbait. These are less rules and more guidelines, but they're guidelines that I learned over time with my adaptive warping method. I'm not a professionally taught weaver. I learned various forms of weaving as a homeschooler, and I have woven on a floor loom, but I'm still working on the adaptive warping methods for my own floor loom, and I'm very new to owning one myself. So I was never taught the right way to weave, and for me that's been a blessing and a boon, because the adaptive warping and weaving methods that I use to be able to weave, despite joints and limbs that don't work, and when they do work, do so with chronic pain. And I'm a stickler for rules, depending on the person telling me them. If an older, more experienced weaver who I looked up to and respected told me that this was the one right way, I would have been putting myself in pain repeatedly to do it that one right way. So in many ways, I'm thankful that I didn't have to do that. So on to the guidelines. Too thick yarn for the warp. Don't do it. It's not worth it. I'm on the struggle bus getting this yarn through the rigid heddle reeds. It's not cooperating, and honestly, it's not supposed to. Just like not putting a square peg into a round hole, don't put a thick yarn skein through a much too small rigid heddle reed. I primarily use an 8-dent reed, which means that I get 8 warp threads per inch. Most of the yarn that I use on this 8-dent reed are fine weight or sport yarn, lightweight or double knit yarn, and medium weight or worsted and Aran yarn. There are so many different names, and they all differ depending on where you live. Once you start getting to the bulky weights, it gets really difficult for an 8-dent reed to handle, let alone the particular adaptive warping coat rack that I use as a warping pegboard. You can see that this bulky yarn is building up around my warping coat rack far too quickly, and you'll see that I'm getting more and more trouble with the warp popping off of the pegs, to the point where I have to stop warping much sooner than I would prefer as I go across the rigid heddle reed. I have trouble with yarn popping sometimes towards the end of a warp, but not to this extent this early, and usually it's because my fingertips decided to be hypermobile in the wrong direction. I'd like to thank you for watching. If you'd like to support my work, some free ways to do that are to like, subscribe or follow, and share. This applies to other small artists as well. It's a great way to let the social media algorithms know that this is content worth watching. If you'd like to support me financially, per your request, there's a Buy Me a Coffee linked below, along with the link to the Hawksong Weaving Square site, where you can purchase unique woven products. I also now have a Patreon that's linked below as well. There are currently 4 actual tiers and 1 very silly tier. These tiers include early access to videos, a weekly post of Life of the HR and OSHA Cats, a Kvetchy diary, being able to vote on projects, fun snail mail, etc. The actual tiers range from $2, $5, $10, and $15. The 5th tier is absolutely a joke, but just in case, in this economy, I won't say no. For $1,000 a month, you can tell me that I'm not actually disabled, I'm just lazy, and to try whatever yoga, juice, cleanse, snake oil nonsense fixed your cousin. I'm absolutely open to other ideas for Patreon, please feel free to comment them. A shout out and thank you to Jujubes, who bought 5 coffees this week. I genuinely appreciate it. That money is going to be going towards vending fees so that I'm able to keep this entire thing going. The next guideline, spreading out your warp on the apron bar. Because of the bulkiness of this yarn and the short width of the warping, it's a total sausage fest. Sausaging is the term for when the edges of the warp get much tighter while the middle balloons, creating a pinched sausage shape. This is a pain in the butt when it happens because it throws the tension off for the whole project. The warp for the selvages becomes extremely tight and the entire weaving takes on a bowed shape due to the unevenness of the warp. Usually I mitigate this through the terry cloth tea towels that I use to wrap and cushion my warp, but the bulky yarn just isn't impressed. Another guideline, make sure your yarn is the right strength and ply. This yarn is not spun tightly enough, nor has enough plies. This is a very loosely spun yarn, and if I was to weave this at the tension that I prefer, I'd be dealing with the warp breaking constantly. And I hate dealing with broken warp threads. There are ways to tie them back together, but it's always such a hassle, and my hands aren't nimble enough to deal with it, so it ends up as a huge irritant. And finally, bulky or fluffy yarn for a warp sucks to weave. Whether you're weaving with a very fluffy merino, or an eyelash yarn, or a bulky yarn like this, any yarn that forces you to shove and pull the rigid heddle like this is just not going to be enjoyable to weave. Instead, it will be an exercise in frustration and will end up making you feel terrible. You're more likely to break the warp, more likely to want to yeet someone through a window should they interrupt you in your futility. Seriously, don't try this when you're having a time hormonally. There's a high chance of you catching charges. The warp thread should slide easily through your rigid heddle reed. Weaving should be a joy, a dance, gliding the heddle across the dance floor, dipping your shuttle, twirling about, and moving back together. Not a battle with shoving and grunting. If you want that, go lift weights and be in your jock era. After battling my way through this weaving and through this scarf, I'm tying off the scarf fringes. I prefer to do 2x2 tied into a fringe of 4, but if I'm short on warp threads, I'll do a double sliding knot of 3. I cannot stress enough how unenjoyable this project was to work on. It was fighting me the entire way, and yeah, just these are guidelines that I use for a reason. Don't do this. I've learned over and over that this does not work and it is not enjoyable. So just, yeah. You can see the sausaging in this particular scarf, and it was, yeah, even the iron didn't want to heat up and actually work on this. But I steam block my wool scarves. This helps the wool fibers to soften into each other and relax into the weave. Without blocking, you can get wrinkles because the weave tends to be stiff without added heat and water. Sort of like how your back gets when you've been sitting in a not great position for too long, and a boiling hot shower takes care of the knots. It can also help ease sausaging, but it won't entirely cure it. This is not my best scarf because I was working with not the best materials for not the best rigid heddle situation. Once the steam blocking is finished, I eyeball the length of the fringe that I want and use the "don't ask me how much I spent on these good shears" and trim it. The final step is between half an hour and 45 minutes of tying the fringe knots. I hope this example and explanation of my guidelines has helped. These are lessons that I've taught myself over my own adaptive warping and weaving experiences the past 2 years. Hopefully my learning has become your learning. And don't worry, nothing goes to waste here at Hawksong Weaving. All of the scraps will be used as stuffing for other projects and other videos down the line. I'm so glad for the odd turn that your path took that brought you here. Thank you for spending time with me at Hawksong Weaving, where we're all a bit warped, and I hope that you have a truly excellent week.